Long before anyone outside Appalachia had ever heard the names Hatfield or McCoy, there was a river that divided two worlds. The Tug Fork snakes between Kentucky and what would become West Virginia, cutting through limestone cliffs and mountains so thick with oak and poplar that sunlight only reached the soil in slivers. It was here, on opposite banks of the same muddy water, that two families would come to define one of the bloodiest private wars in American history. Welcome to Creepalachia. I hope you are ready to hear all about the famous feud, probably the most famous in the world, actually, between the Hatfields and McCoys in Appalachia. I really appreciate you taking the time to be here, and I want to hear all, I know there's tons out there that's, I'm related to old Randall, I'm related to Dave Anse. I want to hear it in the comments, so go ahead and fire away. And before we get started, go ahead and like this video, subscribe to Creepalachia on YouTube if you haven't. And we're trying to get reviews up for the podcast. So if you could, if you're listening on Apple or Spotify, take a minute. Leave a review there. That'll really help the show be found. I can't thank you all enough for diving into these stories with me. It's just such a dream come true to be able to develop this platform with everyone. And I hope you all are enjoying it half as much, at least, as I am bringing it to you. So thank you. Without further ado, let's get into this old-fashioned feud story of the Hatfields and McCoys. In the years before the Civil War, Tug Valley was not much more than a collection of farms and logging camps. The families who settled there were Scots-Irish immigrants and frontiersmen who had wandered west from Virginia and the Carolinas, chasing land and solitude. And they built log cabins, cleared fields by hand, and hunted the black bear and wild turkey that roamed the hollers. Now, everyone knew everyone, as they kind of do now, but it was even more so then. And nearly everyone was related in one way or another. Feuds in those days were not between strangers. They were between cousins, and the Hatfields settled mostly on the West Virginia side of the Tug Fork, then still part of Virginia too. And the family patriarch, Ephraim Hatfield, was born near modern-day Pike County, Kentucky in the early 1800s and raised a large family of farmers and timbermen. His son, William Anderson Hatfield, known to history as Devil Anse Hatfield, would grow into the kind of man who seemed cut from the same rock that built the mountains themselves. Tall, dark-haired, and unflinching. Anse worked as a logger and a farmer, earning respect and fear in equal measure. The nickname, Devil Anse, came not from wickedness, but from his ferocity in battle and his unyielding leadership during the Civil War. Now, across the river lived Randolph McCoy, known to friends and kin as Randall. Old Randall McCoy, and he was born in 1825, the son of Daniel McCoy, and raised among fields of corn and tobacco in the Blackberry Fork area of Pike County. Now, like the Hatfields, the McCoys were hardworking, self-reliant, and proud. Randall was quiet by reputation, a man of faith, who preferred his Bible to his rifle, until the world forced him to choose otherwise. Now, for decades, the family coexisted peacefully enough. They traded goods, attended the same revivals, and even intermarried from time to time, but the Civil War shattered whatever fragile balance the Tug Valley had managed to hold. And when the fighting began in 1861, the valley divided like the country itself, and Kentucky remained loyal to the Union, while the western counties of Virginia, including what would become West by God Virginia, leaned heavily Confederate. The river became a border not just between states, but between beliefs. Neighbors found themselves on opposite sides of the war, and the tension with that split would echo long after. Now, Devil Anse Hatfield joined the Confederate Army early in the war, serving in the Virginia state line under General John B. Floyd before forming his own militia unit known as the Logan Wildcats. They were guerrilla fighters, swift and ruthless, patrolling the Tug Valley to protect Confederate interests and their own families from Union raids. Among his closet allies was his uncle Jim Vance, a man whose temper burned hotter than gunpowder and whose name would soon become synonymous with vengeance. And on the other side stood Asa Harmon McCoy, a cousin of Randall and a Union loyalist. Now, Asa was small-framed, educated, and defiant in his convictions. He enlisted in the 45th Kentucky Infantry and fought for the Union, a decision that branded him a traitor in the eyes of his Confederate neighbors. Now, when the war ended in 1865, Asa Harmon returned home to Pike County. His health was broken, but his pride was intact. And his family actually warned him to leave the valley, to go north where old allegiances mattered less. But he stayed. He had fought to preserve the Union, he said, and he had the right to live on the land where he was born. That winter, someone proved him wrong. So, on the night of January 7th, 1865, Asa Harmon McCoy was ambushed while hiding in a cave near his home on Grapevine Creek. He had been warned that the Logan Wildcats were hunting him, but the war was over, or so he thought. Shots rang out through the night, and Asa Harmon was found dead the next morning, his leg broken, his body riddled with bullets. No one was ever tried for the killing, and the chief suspect was Jim Vance, but Devil Anse's name appeared in every rumor. And for his part, Anse denied any role, claiming he had been homesick when it happened, and the valley didn't believe him. The killing of Asa Harmon McCoy became the first blood of a feud that would not cool for nearly 3 decades. And the Civil War left behind more than just graves. It left bitterness. Veterans returned home with guns, grudges, and little else. Farms had been burned, sons lost, and justice felt as far away as Washington himself. Now, in places like Tug Valley, where courts were few and sheriffs fewer, law became personal. A man's word was his verdict, and his rifle was the gavel. And by 1870, both families had rebuilt their lives, but not their trust. Devil Anse expanded his timber operation, employing dozens of men from the surrounding counties, while also dabbling in the lucrative but illegal whiskey trade that thrived in the mountains. He was known to run flatboats of lumber and moonshine down the Tug Fork to markets farther south, earning enough to buy land and influence. And the Hatfields became one of the wealthier families on the West Virginia side. Now, the McCoys, meanwhile, clung to their modest farm on Blackberry Fork. Randall and his wife Sarah raised a dozen children, all of whom grew up in the shadow of hard work and quiet pride. Their fields were rocky, their livestock was few, but their reputation was unblemished until 1878, when a single hog reignited the valley's smoldering resentment. But before the feud could return to blood, it began in whispers. The people of Tug Valley lived in a world where rumor was currency and the gossip that passed between the cabins could buy loyalty or damn a family. They spoke of the Hatfields' growing wealth, their timber contracts, their friends in Charleston. They spoke of the McCoys' envy and their belief that the Hatfields had forgotten what it meant to be humble mountain folk. It wasn't true, not entirely, but in the hills, truth didn't matter as much as who said it first. So in the evenings, men gathered around hearty fires or church porches to trade stories of hunting trips, land disputes, and politics. And that always goes well, as we all know, and each tale stretched a little farther than the last. Some said the Hatfields were trying to push the McCoys off their land to make room for timber rights. Others claimed the McCoys were plotting revenge for Asa Harmon's death. In the stillness of those nights, while the crickets sang and the moon rose over the tug, words began to harden into grudges. Now, by the time 1878 arrived, the valley was a powder keg. All it needed was a spark. And that spark, in the most Appalachian way imaginable, was over a hog. So in 1878, a McCoy hog wandered onto the land down by the Hatfields. Sweet! In the mountains, free stock roamed freely, and ownership was proven not by brands or papers, but by the notches cut into the animal's ears. So each family had their own pattern. One could be a checkered mark, one could be like 2 lines, or like a triangle. It's basically passed down through generations. And Randall McCoy claimed the hog was his. Floyd Hatfield, on the other hand, a cousin to Devil Anse, said otherwise. Now, both men were certain of their right, and neither would back down. The dispute made its way before the local justice of the peace, Anderson Preacher Anse Hatfield, as he was known, another cousin to Devil Anse, and a man caught squarely between kinship and law. Now, at the hearing, a half dozen neighbors crowded into the one-room cabin that served as the court. The air smelled of wood, smoke, and sweat, and each side brought witnesses, each carving stories sharper than the knives themselves. And the key testimony came from Bill Staten, who was related to both families, and he swore the hog belonged to the Hatfields. So because of that, Preacher Anse ruled in favor of Floyd Hatfield, and it should have been the end of it. A single animal returned, an argument settled, everybody digging in the bacon. But in Tug Valley, pride meant more than pork. Randall McCoy left the hearing humiliated. His wife Sarah tried to calm him down, but the loss stung. The McCoys were poor farmers, and to them, that hog represented months of food. And worse, it meant the community now whispered that Randall had been bested by a Hatfield and by one of their own kin as judge. Now, the grudge simmered until 1880 when Bill Staten, the man whose testimony had tipped the scales, was shot dead by 2 of Randall's nephews, Sam and Paris McCoy. Now, the nephews claimed self-defense. The judge, perhaps remembering the hog trial, acquitted them, and that verdict reopened every old wound the valley had tried to scab over since Asa Harmon's death. Now, the Hatfields called the acquittal an insult to justice. The McCoys said it was karma. Neither family forgot. Then 2 years later, love threw a match into the pile and said boom. It happened on Election Day in 1880 at a gathering near Blackberry Creek, and the day was meant for politics, whiskey, and laughter. And it was actually the closest thing to a holiday most mountain families saw. There was dancing, music and food, and men in suspenders, women in Sunday dresses, and the faint hum of moonshine moving through the crowd. Now, among the Hatfields was Johnsy, Devil Anse's eldest son. Handsome, smooth-talking, and not yet 20. He carried himself like a man who'd never lost a fight, his blue eyes bright under the brim of his hat. And among the McCoys was Rosanna, Randall's daughter, 21, striking, and known for her independence. When their eyes met across the crowd, the feud might as well had vanished. That evening, they disappeared together, and by morning, Rosanna had crossed the Tug Fork with Johnsy to the Hatfield side, and for days, the valley buzzed. Some called it a romance. It was kind of like the Titanic movie with Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet, but like in the 1800s, which that technically was as well. So imagine the Appalachian Titanic. That's what we'll call it. But others called it treason, and the McCoys were furious. Randall refused to speak her name, and her mother wept in the doorway. Now, on the Hatfield side, Devil Anse was no happier. The idea of his son courting a McCoy felt like a curse, and Rosanna stayed with the Hatfields for a long time, hoping love could bridge a river that history already filled with blood. They just didn't know it yet. But gossip flowed faster than the Tug Fork. When she learned she was pregnant, Johnsy promised marriage, but then he broke it. And under pressure from his father, he married Rosanna's cousin, Nancy McCoy, instead. The betrayal devastated her. Now, when Johnsy was later arrested by Kentucky officers for bootlegging, it was Rosanna who warned the Hatfields, saving his life, but her loyalty earned her no reward. She returned home to her parents, broken and shunned, and her baby died before its first birthday, sadly. Now, within a few years, Rosanna herself died of pneumonia, or, as the Valley liked to say, of a broken heart. And even in death, her story divided the Tug Fork. The McCoys blamed the Hatfields for ruining her life. The Hatfields blamed the McCoys for raising a daughter who dared cross that river that day. And in truth, Rosanna was the only one who ever tried to make peace. And by 1882, the feud had become the valley's second religion. Men carried rifles to church and revolvers to weddings. Every hunt, every business deal, every whispered insult risked another grave. The courts were powerless. Each county had its own loyalties, its own sheriffs. The law didn't reach the backwoods. It barely reached the courthouse steps back then. And that summer, Devil Anse's brother, Ellison Hatfield, rode into Pike County for another Election Day celebration. And why in the world did they keep doing these? Politics never ends well, but at the same time, people can talk and not do some crazy stuff like this. So thank God times have changed, but Ellison was well liked. He was loud and proud of it. He was a Confederate veteran who never stopped wearing his soldier's boots. And at some point during the day, Ellison quarreled with three of Randall McCoy's sons, Tolbert, Farmer, and Randolph Jr., and no one could later agree on what started it, but some said it was whiskey. Others said it was the politics. But before the sun set, knives were drawn. Witnesses later testified that Ellison was stabbed 27 times and then shot once in the back. He somehow survived long enough to be carried across the Tug Fork to the West Virginia side, where Devil Anse waited by his bedside. Kentucky deputies quickly arrested the three McCoy brothers. Their plan was to take them to Pikeville for trial, but word traveled fast, and by the time that the posse reached the river, Devil Anse and his men were waiting with guns drawn. The lawmen actually handed the brothers over. They were hoping to prevent another bloodbath. For 2 days, the McCoy boys were held under guard near the Hatfield home while Ellison lay dying. When he finally succumbed to his wounds on August 9th, Devil Anse gave the order. The brothers were marched to a spot near the river, tied to pawpaw bushes, and executed by a firing squad of Hatfields. The killing sent shockwaves through the mountains. Even those who had once admired Devil Anse's leadership turned uneasy, and the McCoys buried their dead and vowed revenge. Kentucky lawmen promised justice, but across the border in West Virginia, Hatfields claimed self-defense. The river between them might as well have been the Atlantic. From that moment, there was no going back, and by the time the smoke cleared from the pawpaw grove, the feud was no longer a family matter. It was a regional war. The killings of Tolbert, Farmer, and Randolph McCoy Jr. shocked even the roughest corners of the Appalachians. Word spread by horseback and rumor faster than newspaper could print. And within a week, preachers in Pike County were condemning the Hatfields from their pulpits, calling them godless men who had spat in the face of law. And West Virginia churches stayed silent. To them, the McCoy boys had murdered Ellison Hatfield in cold blood, and justice had simply been carried out on home soil. Now, the truth was lost somewhere in the middle, if you ask me. Both sides had shed blood, and both believed they were right. The pawpaw executions marked the first time the feud spilled across state lines in open defiance of the law, and Kentucky demanded the arrest of Devil Anse and his men for the murder. West Virginia refused, arguing that the killings had happened within its borders. Neither side trusted the other's courts, and the governors soon found themselves at odds. It wasn't just Hatfields versus McCoys anymore. It was Kentucky versus West by God, Virginia, and meanwhile, the people of the Tug Valley lived in a kind of siege. Families built false walls in their homes to hide children during raids. Travel after sunset was pretty much a death wish. Even church revivals were divided by bloodline. Sermons about forgiveness were delivered to half-empty pews, and then came the reporters. So by the mid-1880s, America had grown fascinated with the idea of the mountain outlaws. Big city papers in New York, Cincinnati, and Chicago dispatched writers to the Tug Fork to chronicle the savagery of these backwoods clans, as they called them. And they arrived with notebooks and assumptions, sketching the Hatfields and McCoys as caricatures, barefoot, ignorant, and drunk on moonshine. The nuance was lost, replaced by headlines that sold papers. Quote, "Appalachian vendetta continues, another bloody day in feud country," end quote. Now, the truth was uglier and simpler. Most of the valley's people wanted peace, but were trapped by loyalty and fear. And those who tried to stay neutral were accused by both sides of betrayal. Every gunshot birthed another rumor, and every rumor fueled another funeral. Now, by 1887, the feud had reached its boiling point. Both families had armed posses, each calling themselves guards, but acting more like militias. Devil Anse, now in his early 50s, had grown rich from timber contracts and kept a loyal following of men who worked with him in the logging camps. And Randall McCoy, aging and weary, had lost 3 sons and honestly most of his faith. Now, that winter, tragedy came for him again. On the night of January 1st, 1888, a band of Hatfields led by Jim Vance and Cap Hatfield crept across the river to Blackberry Creek. Snow covered the ground and the moon hung low and sharp. Inside the cabin was Randall McCoy and his wife, Sarah. They were asleep with several of their children. And just before dawn, gunfire tore through the walls. The family woke to chaos, splintered wood, screams, and the smell of smoke. Bullets ripped through the cabin as torches hit the roof. Sarah McCoy was struck in the face by a pistol, her teeth shattered. 2 of her children, Calvin and Alifair, were gunned down as they ran for the door, which is just horrific. Randall himself escaped into the woods barefoot, the flames behind him lighting up the snow. Now, by sunrise, the house was gone. All that remained was the chimney and the blackened outline of where the McCoy family had once knelt to pray. The New Year's Massacre, as the newspapers called it, became the darkest chapter of the feud. Even those loyal to the Hatfields whispered that things had gone too far. The killings unified Kentucky in outrage. Governor Simon Buckner issued warrants for the arrest of all involved, including Devil Anse himself. Now, across the river, West Virginia's governor, Emanuel Wilson, refused to cooperate, calling the warrants an invasion of state sovereignty. But lawmen weren't the only ones mobilizing. The McCoys gathered friends and allies into a posse led by a tough, mustached deputy named Frank Phillips. He was a former Confederate, a marksman, and a man who understood the difference between the letter of the law and the kind you enforce with a rifle. Now, his posse began raiding across the border, capturing Hatfield partisans wherever they could find them, and the Hatfields fired back, sometimes literally. Gunfights erupted in the mountains and along the riverbanks. The Tug Fork Valley became a no man's land, patrolled by men who believed they were soldiers in a holy war. Now, in early 1888, Phillips's men caught Jim Vance, the same man long suspected of killing Asa Harmon McCoy 23 years earlier. Accounts differ on what happened next, but most agree that Vance was shot dead trying to flee. His body was left in the snow as a message. Kentucky would have its justice, one way or another. So over the next several months, Phillips captured 9 Hatfield men, including Cap Hatfield and Devil Anse's son Johnsy. The prisoners were dragged back across the Tug Fork to stand trial in Kentucky, and technically their capture was kidnapping, practically. But it was war by another name, and the dispute escalated to the highest court in the land. The case was Mahone versus Justice, and it asked whether men taken from one state without legal extradition could be tried in another. And in 1888, the Supreme Court ruled that they could. The decision set a national precedent and marked the first time Washington had intervened in a feud born from Appalachian soil. But back in the valley, no one cared about legal precedent. What mattered was blood for blood. And when the trials finally began in 1889 in Pikeville, Kentucky, the courthouse was packed with spectators, reporters, and kin from both sides. The proceedings actually lasted for weeks, and witnesses contradicted themselves constantly. Memories were blurred, and the air inside grew thick with tension. The star defendant was Ellison Mounts, a young Hatfield relative accused of taking part in the New Year's Massacre. He was barely in his 20s. He was frightened and likely guilty of a little more than following orders. But the public demanded a hanging, and the jury obliged. So on February 18th, 1890, Mounts was led to the gallows before a crowd of thousands. Vendors sold hot peanuts and lemonade while preachers shouted verses over the din. How crazy is that? But that's how they used to roll back in the 1800s. And when the trap door opened and the rope snapped, the crowd fell silent. And for the first time in years, the Tug Fork heard no gunfire. The feud, as far as the courts were concerned, was over. But the mountains held grudges longer than men. The gallows didn't end the feud, it only changed its rhythm, and the valley fell into a silence that wasn't peace, it was just exhaustion. And for years afterward, both families lived with the consequences of their own legend. The Hatfields, once powerful in Logan County, found their influence fading. Devil Anse's timber contracts dried up, and the men who'd once followed him as if he were a general began to scatter into the coal fields. He was aging now, his beard streaked gray, his body heavy from years of whiskey and guilt, and he'd won every battle that mattered to him and lost every reason to keep fighting. And on the Kentucky side, Randolph McCoy wasn't faring any better. He'd buried 5 children before their time and lived with scars, physical and otherwise. And it started ever since that New Year's night. I mean, there's so much he went through, but that night really just took the soul out of him. And his wife, Sarah, carried a crooked jaw and a vacant stare. Her injuries were permanent reminders of what pride had cost them. The McCoys' farmhouse was never rebuilt. Randall tried once, but neighbors whispered it was cursed, so he let the land grow wild again, and what was left of the McCoy clan scattered, some to Pikeville, some north toward Ohio and Indiana, places where the Hatfield name carried less weight. And those who stayed behind lived quietly, keeping to themselves, pretending the feud had been a story about other people. And the Hatfields, too, began to fade from notoriety. The law had taken its toll, and Devil Anse's sons, Cap and Johnsy, spent time behind bars, while others drifted into honest work. They dug coal, farmed, raised families that would one day bear the burden of a surname like a scar. But while the rifles had gone quiet, the newspapers never stopped and the feud sold papers. And the more time that passed, the more dramatic the stories became. Now, by the early 1900s, the Hatfield McCoys weren't people anymore. They were symbols. Reporters and novelists romanticized their violence as something ancient and uniquely Appalachian. The words mountain feud became shorthand for ignorance. Writers described the families as backwoods savages, illiterate and lawless hill folk, feeding the rest of the country's appetite for a stereotype it could point at and say, see, that's why they're different, that right there. And in truth, the feud had little to do with ignorance and everything to do with isolation. The Tug Fork Valley was a place the government had forgotten. Roads were bad, schools were few, and lawmen often owed their allegiance to kin more than to the state. And when the system fails to deliver justice, people start delivering it themselves. And as the new century arrived, the old mountains began to change. Railroads cut through the ridges that had never been seen before, and coal companies bought up land that had once belonged to Hatfield and McCoys alike. Outsiders moved in with contracts, wages, promises of prosperity. And within a generation, both families were working in the same mines, digging from the same seams of coal, and cashing checks from the same corporate owners. And, it was pretty much coal script back then, but you get what I'm saying. And that irony didn't escape anyone. The valley had spent 40 years fighting over property lines, only to watch strangers take the land altogether. And in 1911, the newspapers found their way back to Tug Valley for one last story. The old warlord himself, Devil Anse Hatfield, had announced that he was giving his life to God. And on a crisp Sunday afternoon, hundreds gathered along Island Creek near his home in Logan County to watch him be baptized. Dressed in white, the man who'd once been called the Devil of the Tug Fork stepped into the cold mountain water and bowed his head. The preacher lowered him under, and when Devil Anse came up, he smiled. The first smile anyone could remember on his face in years. It wasn't absolution, but it was something close. And 10 years later, on January 6, 1921, Devil Anse died at the age of 81. His funeral was attended by both Hatfields and McCoys. They buried him in a family cemetery overlooking the valley, beneath a life-sized marble statue carved in his likeness. Rifle in hand, eyes fixed toward Kentucky. Now, Randall McCoy, he actually died 7 years before that, in 1914, after a tragic accident. Some say he fell into a fire while tending his chimney. Others claim he simply grew too old and too tired to fight anymore, and his death made little news. There were no reporters, no crowds, no marble statues, just a quiet burial in the hills of Pike County beside the wife and children who died before him. And after their deaths, the feud finally drifted into memory. The new generation of the Hatfield McCoys inherited land, not grudges. The rise of the coal industry pulled them together in new ways the old world never could. They worked the same shifts, lived in the same company housing, and sent their children to the same schools. And by the 1940s, marriages between the Hatfields and McCoys weren't scandalous. They were just common. Still, the legend refused to die. Hollywood discovered it, then television. By the 1950s, cartoonists were using the names as punchlines. Hatfield and McCoy. You can go down to Pigeon Forge and you'll see it. Caricatures of the Hatfield McCoys, which, I'm sure that place is awesome. Nothing against it, but, it's a joke. It basically became shorthand for any two rivals who were too stubborn to quit. And the families themselves watched from their porches, half amused and half insulted, as the nation turned their pain into comedy. Yet, even through those caricatures, the valley kept its dignity. Locals knew that beneath every joke was a truth the rest of the world had forgotten. That the feud wasn't about ignorance or even pride. It was about survival. It was about two families caught in a world without justice, forced to make their own. Now, of course, I'm sure we'd all agree, they made some really bad choices that we wouldn't make today. But again, think of the times you were living in and the frustration that would come from losing your children. I know you all can relate to that. Now, it's true the feud is history now, but history also has a way of lingering here in Appalachia. The hills don't forget, and neither do the people who call them home. The feud had fallen quiet, sure, but its echo stayed, and for the people of Tug Valley, the story was never just history. It was inheritance. Grandparents spoke of the times with the same hush reserved for scripture, careful not to say who fired first or who deserved what. The children of both clans learned early that some questions didn't really need answers. And by the middle of the 20th century, Appalachia was changing faster than anyone could remember. Coal towns rose and fell like tides. The trains screamed through the hollows and then echoed as they disappeared. And the mountain that had once sheltered isolation now carried radios and newspapers. The names Hatfield and McCoy appeared in jokes and in school books and eventually on television screens and even still today. And it was strange the people who bore those names saw their ancestors turned into cartoons and punchlines, yet the caricature gave way to curiosity. Historians and documentarians began peeling back the actual layers, and they found deeds, letters, and depositions that painted a far more complex picture. A valley caught between Reconstruction and industrialization, a legal system too weak to arbitrate, and two families trying to maintain dignity in a world that didn't yet understand them. What outsiders had called savagery looked up close a lot like survival. And through the 1960s and 70s, both states leaned into their shared notoriety. Kentucky erected historical markers, and West Virginia curated museum exhibits. Relatives who had once crossed the river with rifles now crossed it with photo albums. In the late 1970s, a joint genealogy project began linking the two bloodlines, and by 1984, Hatfield and McCoy descendants were meeting regularly to compare family trees and trade stories that had softened with time. Then, in 2003, the year I graduated high school, something symbolic happened. More than a century after the pawpaw bushes turned red, over 100 descendants met in Pikeville for a family reunion. There were no sheriffs, no rifles, no anger, just kin. And the following year, the governors of Kentucky and West Virginia signed a formal peace treaty, declaring the feud officially ended after 121 years. It was ceremony, sure, but it mattered. And on the courthouse lawn, the last ghost of the feud got its pardon. Today, the Hatfield-McCoy name threads through Appalachian tourism. The ATV trail system that cuts across southern West Virginia actually bears the family's names, the Hatfield-McCoy trail system, drawing riders from around the country. And each August, the Heritage Days Festival brings both clans together for bluegrass, storytelling, and mock trials that reenact the famous hog dispute for laughs. And in the museums, visitors can see rifles, court papers, and hand-sewn dresses, ordinary artifacts from extraordinary lives. But beneath the tourist gloss, the valley keeps its reverence. The cemeteries tell the real story. The Hatfield Cemetery near Sarah Ann lies on a wooded ridge. The marble statue of Devil Anse, still watching over the valley. Across the river, on a quieter slope, rests the McCoy Cemetery. Smaller, weathered, and nearly hidden by laurel. Between them runs the same muddy river that once defined the line between justice and revenge. And the feud's legacy isn't violence anymore. It's memory. It reminds Appalachia and anyone willing to listen that pride can become a prison and that forgiveness sometimes has to be learned generations late. The Hatfield McCoys never wrote down their piece, but their grandchildren did something better. They lived it. When the 2012 miniseries revived national interest, like I was telling you about earlier with Kevin Costner and Bill Paxton, locals braced for another round of ridicule, but instead, the production employed regional actors, shot on real hillsides, and treated the story with gravity. Now, the series wasn't shot there, actually, where it happened, which would have been freaking awesome, but they did try to treat the story with some respect. And viewers saw something they hadn't before. Families torn apart by war, poverty, honor, not caricature, but consequence. And for once, the mountains were shown as they truly are. Beautiful, harsh, and human. Drive the Tug Fork at dawn, and you can still feel it. Mist rises off the water like memory made visible. The ridges hold their shape, the way they always have. Green in the summer, gray in the winter. And if you stop your car and cut off the engine, you'll hear nothing but the current, the wind, maybe a distant dog bark. Somewhere beyond the tree line lies the site of the old McCoy cabin. Nothing left but the stones of the chimney. A few miles upstream, the pawpaw bushes still grow wild, their fruit ripening quietly every August. And some nights, locals say you can hear echoes, gunfire rolling down the holler like thunder that's taken a wrong turn. Others say it's just the mountains remembering, doing what they always do. Whatever it is, it serves as a reminder. Every feud, no matter how loud, eventually fades into the same silence. What remains is the lesson left behind. The Hatfields and McCoys proved that pride can outlive purpose, that grief can cross generations, and that peace, when it finally comes, doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It just slips in quietly and takes a seat at the table. More than a century after the first shot, the Tug Fork runs steady, carrying pieces of both families downstream. It carries their ashes, their sins, and their forgiveness. And maybe that's the ending they all deserved. Not a truce on paper, but a river that keeps on moving forward, even when people can't. That'll be all for this story of the Hatfields and McCoys. I hope you enjoyed. Such history in these hills, and that's definitely a big one. Hope it cleared up some misconceptions there, and hope we got everything right. I really try hard to fact check and do a good job on these scripts, and I'm sure I missed something, but if I did, just let me know, and we'll put an editor's note in there. But tried to get it right, and I know it's pretty daggone close, but even still, I appreciate you taking the time to listen. Be sure to like this video before you leave. Subscribe to Creepalachia on YouTube if you haven't. And again, on Apple and Spotify, really trying to get those reviews up on the podcast version. If you could take a minute, leave a review, you can just click the star button. That'll really help the show be found. I appreciate you so much. We are on Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram, and we do have merch now, creepalachia.shop. And which team are you, Hatfield or McCoy? It sounds like we're all on the same team now, so that's what I'm going to pick. And I appreciate you. Hope you have a good night. And last but not least, always remember, above all else, long live Appalachia.